Buenas tardes, buena tarde, good afternoon, Doctora Fredara Hadley and your students following us today from New York. We are very pleased that you all are here, and some of you returning, some of you are very loyal and coming every week, and welcome to everyone that's joining us for the first time. We apologize that last week's session with Dr. Lucy O'Brien had to be postponed about punk feminism, but we are here to remind you that will resume her presentation on Monday, the 25th of April, so in 3 weeks from today. And also to remind you that today's session will be recorded so that you can access this and the past gender sound sessions at the ESMUC website. And thanks again to ESMUC for their commitment and for hosting our seminars. We are extremely happy and pleased to introduce today to Dr. Fredara Hadley. She's an ethnomusicologist professor at the Juilliard School, a world leader school in performing arts education created in New York in 1905, where she teaches courses on ethnomusicology and African American music in the music history department. Dr. Hadley's commentary is featured in several documentaries, including the recent released PBS doc-series, The Black Church, hosted by Professor Henry Louis Gates. Also, we recommend you to look for Dr. Hadley's forthcoming book, focusing on the musical impact of historically Black colleges and universities. This research has been presented in conferences, both domestic and abroad, and her work has been published also in academic journals and other publications. And in today's sessions, Aretha Franklin and the Efficacy of Black Feminine Genius, Dr. Hadley will explore what Black feminine genius can mean. She won't use gender and race to qualify genius, but rather to acknowledge that genius is always gender and racialized. So then her talk will observe the impact of Black feminine genius within Black music communities, including Black women, Black queer audiences, imagining how considering the efficacy of genius can lead us to a more diverse sense of what mastery and genius mean. So without further delay, let's start the presentation, and just remind you that afterwards we will have questions and answers, and that I can translate them to English if you might need to. Thank you. And welcome, Fredara.
Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Good.
Yeah.
I'm really excited to be here. Thank you, Dr. Bronson, for having me. This has been I've seen the lineup of scholars that you all have been able to speak with, and I'm flattered and honored to be among them. So I'm delighted to join you all, albeit virtually. I certainly wish that I were in Spain with a lot of you, but I'm delighted that technology allows me to join you all today from New York City and allows me to reunite with Dr. Bronson's where we first met in California.
Right.
So here we are virtually, in person in California, I should say. We have to qualify those things these days.
That's true.
I'm very excited to speak with you all today about Black feminine genius and Aretha Franklin. And I want to make sure that I leave time for questions because I really enjoy being pushed in new ways through conversation about these topics. As I present today, this is a subject, which I'll talk about in a moment, that I've been living with for a while, both the idea of genius and in some ways a reclamation of the term genius, and also Aretha Franklin. I currently have an edited volume on Aretha Franklin under contract with Cambridge University Press. So I'll talk more about that project towards the end of my talk. But when I say I've been living with Aretha Franklin in my head and in my ears and in my heart, I truly mean that. And it's been a delightful journey thus far. So let me begin. As I mentioned today, I've been thinking, I want to share a bit about my journey with the word genius. And while my work is not explicitly about it, rethinking and reimagining genius has reframed my scholarship, pedagogy, and listening. So let me tell you a little bit about how I even came to this. I've taught music conservatories for 10 years at this point, teaching primarily classical and jazz musicians, and it's been a joy. I teach at the Juilliard School here in New York City, and prior to that, I taught at Oberlin Conservatory in Ohio, two of the best conservatories in the United States. And in one of my classes where we were talking about gender, I don't know how the idea came to me, but I asked students to name musicians that they thought were geniuses, just name them without any real qualification. I would write down every suggestion on the board. And I did this for several years. And it didn't matter the gender makeup of the students in the class, the result was consistently the same, that the board was full of men, and very rarely women. And if there were women on the board, most of them were singers, very few women instrumentalists. And, that just sort of prodded my thinking and how we canonize the idea of genius and who gets to be qualified to become one, right? So that was one thing that happened out of the classroom. The second thing that happened actually doesn't relate to Aretha Franklin. It relates to another Black American woman singer, Beyonce. A few years ago in 2016, Beyonce released an album called Lemonade, and a visual album to go along with her audio album. And the album was met with tremendous success commercially and tremendous enthusiasm among listeners. And a part of that conversation was people advocating for, she is a genius. What she has created is genius level work. And that's interesting, but I was more interested in almost the immediate response, arguing why Beyonce cannot be a genius, right? What is disqualifying her from becoming and being recognized as a genius? I didn't really have a stake in one argument or the other, but the discourse I found endlessly fascinating. And the arguments were grounded in the fact that, one, she collaborated with lots of people, affirming this idea that we think of genius as a solitary act, something done by one and one alone, not in community or in partnership with others. The other was that she was not yet old enough and she wasn't an instrumentalist. So we had an argument about age and we had an argument about the technicality of her musicianship. But it was also interesting that the people most passionately advocating for her role as genius were other Black American women who saw themselves in her work, saw themselves in her song, saw herself in the interiority that Beyonce reveals in the Lemonade Project. And so that sparked my thinking, where, if Black women recognize an artist as a genius, where does that sit and live in our discourse about the term genius, right? And so those were the two prongs that got me thinking about genius. Now, as it relates to Aretha Franklin in particular, we know that she passed away on April 16th, 2018. Can't believe it's been almost 4 years. And she had a funeral in her hometown of Detroit, Michigan, that was aired on the internet for all to see. And the funeral was about 8 hours. And about I watched the entire thing. 7 hours of it was appropriately reflective and loving tribute to a queen of soul. 1 hour of it was terrible. And that was the portion in which the preacher, the one charged with honoring her legacy through spoken word, denigrated her legacy. And again, I was mindful of this schism between how the Black women who participated in her funeral services uplifted her carefully, lovingly, and rendered through song and word what she had meant to them in their lives. And so did some of the men. Yet this preacher, the one who wielded the most power in her funeral service, chose to use that moment to chip away at all that she had created over the course of her career. And so what happened in the aftermath of that moment, and this is a well-documented moment that spawned lots of think pieces, there was this need to kind of rush in and save our queen, unimaginable, even in death, from this this vile vitriol that she felt she had received even in death. So that got me thinking again about what is it that Black women are recognizing when they call someone a genius, or when they call someone their queen. Again, I'm not arguing for the removal of geniuses. What I am suggesting is that we should consider and take seriously the masters that a community recognizes and the reasons why they recognize them as such. So when I use the term Black feminine genius, which I'll define in a moment, I galvanize around that term because it, for me, has been a site of liberating thinking about music and its connection to its audiences. It reminds me that the music that is shared doesn't only belong to the people who create it, but belongs to the world that it creates for itself. And in thinking about Aretha Franklin, I'll talk about this in a moment, I think about songs like Spirit in the Dark that she created that have been adopted and incorporated into safe LGBTQ Black queer spaces and adopted as an anthem. The second point about Black feminine genius is that it centers community because it doesn't rely on a solitary model of mastery. It allows for collaboration. It allows for connection with the audience, with the community in which that music comes to reside. So in the absence of robust conversations about when, where Black women's musical performances enter into the genius realm, more scholars, particularly Black American women scholars, are offering hearty insight as they help to create a richer narrative about the Black feminine contributions to American popular music, and we could say global popular music as well, and the purpose that this music serves in the lives of Black feminine listeners. And when I say feminine here, that isn't exclusive to cisgendered women, but wherever femininity and whoever body femininity resides. In her article, Mary Lou Williams, Place Like a Man, Gender, Genius, and Difference in Black Music Discourse, Nicole Rustin calls for us to develop models of Black feminine genius. So the term I employ here is her term. And as an extension of that, and in that work, she talks about the great jazz pianist, Mary Lou Williams, who was an architect of the bebop era. And certainly she helped to mentor jazz greats like Thelonious Monk and Dizzy Gillespie. She did charts for Duke Ellington. She recorded records in Chicago and played in Kansas City with the Basie Band, just an extraordinary musician. And one of my personal faves. So this talk isn't about her, but I can always talk about Mary Lou Williams because I adore her. But the compliment, which really isn't a compliment that was most often given to her, is that she plays like a man. What are we saying with a term like that? We're saying that she is good because she sounds to us, the listener, as something we recognize as masculine. And in that statement, that repudiates and refuses any access to something that might be feminine. And if it is feminine, it is undesirable, right? So Nicole Rustin pushes us to think about, well, what does Black feminine genius sound like? If we are clear very often about what Black masculine genius sounds like, particularly in jazz and hip hop, well, then there must be some expansion of that to be inclusive of all of those who make music and listen and contribute to the musical community. So Nicole Rustin gave me the term and the push to think about Black feminine genius. And as an extension of that thought, in her book, If You Can't Be Free, Be a Mystery, In Search of Billie Holiday, the literary scholar, Farah Jasmine Griffin, thoughtfully considers Holiday's cultural and historical impact when she situates the functionality of genius by saying, if I want to qualify my use of the word genius, at times I exchange it for the word brilliance, which seems to be a less loaded term. But I'm not using genius in the romantic sense of that tormented yet inspired individual who stands above the rest of humanity. By genius, I mean the special quality of mind and aptitudes that some individuals have innately for specific tasks or kinds of work That part about specific tasks and kinds of work is how I get to this idea of efficacy and really thinking beyond just the label of genius to start to wrap our mind around the why of genius and the hows of genius. And for me, that pushes my thinking further towards what Nicole Rustin is asking us to think about with Black feminine genius. Farah Jasmine Griffin calls the word genius loaded, as it has always been a subjective and contextual label that is heavy with society's baggage of sexism, racism, and bias. Her subsequent analysis of Holiday heavily relies on Holiday's ability to channel both the vulnerability and the resolve of Black women's lives. Scholars such as Farah Jasmine Griffin and Angela Davis have written clearly and lovingly about the efficacy of genius in the music of blues women such as Bessie Smith, Billie Holiday, and Gertrude Ma Rainey. Their consideration rests on how the music of these Black women served the unique needs of Black women's lives. And I should say here too, clearly with these women, it is not exclusively Black women audiences to whom they are singing, but it is that interiority of Black women's lives that they keep at the center of their artistry. In other words, these women inform us that the source of their genius is in the ability to embody and reflect the lived experiences of Black women in song in such a way that Black women recognize their own reflection. Angela Davis writes, Bessie Smith was the real genius of her craft. She was not only the greater artist, she more accurately represented the socio-historical patterns of Black people's lives. She further writes, Lady Day's genius, Billie Holiday's genius, was to give her life experiences an aesthetic form that recast them as windows through which other women could peer critically at their own lives. She offered other women the possibility to understand the social contradictions they embodied and enacted in their own lives. In both cases, Davis not only acknowledges their superior talents, but she cites the source of their resonance with Black feminine audiences. We must remember that Bessie Smith was an absolute star during her lifetime, and that Billie Holiday was also revered in her lifetime. Their art during their lifetime was not relic, but it was used and understood by many audiences, including Black women. And so this point of emphasizing Black women audiences is really important because I think in general, when we're talking about music, we often in our discourse assume a masculine audience. We often do not take seriously music that primarily resonates with women, certainly here in the United States. So for instance, the popularity of K-pop bands like BTS that largely resonate with young women, we write that music off as fluff or superfluous. We do not take seriously why these artists and these bands resonate so strongly with young women precisely in the moment where they are so consumed with navigating and figuring out their own social identity. We call it, even in the world of hip hop, I've heard people talk about, oh, if you are a rapper, you have to have a chick record or a girl record on your album, something that is going to appeal to women. And that is often a term that is used derisively, right? It is to be dismissive of perhaps what is appealing to women. And I don't want to overemphasize the sort of determination of who likes what kinds of music, because we know that these things, at the end of the day, very often transcend our identifiers. But there are trends that we can pay attention to. We had genres of music in the United States and movements of music in the United States known as women's music. We had fairs, tours like the Lilith Fair tour that deliberately catered to a predominantly woman audience and women who were open about the fact that they were making music for a women audience. That still often was stratified along both racial and sexuality lines. Oftentimes that music was lesbian identified and white identified. And so again, we get into some of these demographic points, but the larger point being that there are ways that are productive to think about the music that resonates most with a woman audience, with a feminine audience. And so I think it is worthwhile always to take the music of any community as valid and serious, but particularly those of women. So just a little more context there. So now I'll shift into talking a bit more about Aretha Franklin. Again, thinking about what Angela Davis points to, these singers, Bessie Smith, Billie Holiday, and their ability to, and she says about Billie Holiday's ability to develop an aesthetic form, Billie Holiday's way of singing, her way of phrasing and using what some called a small voice to convey such pain, such joy, such love through song, creates this window for women for whom her reality is also their reality, can see themselves in the aesthetic model that she creates. That takes us back to Farah Jasmine Griffin's point that says genius isn't just about a label, it is about what one who possesses a certain level of competencies is able to do. And thus, we're talking about the facilitation of community. If one can see and hear themselves in song and music, that can help to build connection, not just with the artist and the listener, but with the listeners, plural. And we'll see examples of that in a moment. And so those ideas were very attractive to me to try and understand Aretha Franklin, and particularly as a young African-American woman who grew up with Aretha Franklin's music, so much so that I took it for granted. I heard it on the radio, I heard it in my house, I heard the gospel song she sang. I also grew up in the same denomination of Christianity, the Black Baptist Church. So I heard those same songs in church. Aretha Franklin was always in my life, right? But she was in the Blues Brothers, she was in the movies. And so there was lots of Aretha Franklin. But what I was called to pay attention to is how she strongly resonated with my mother, with my aunt, with the older women in my life who saw themselves in the stories that she sang, but not just the stories that she sang, but how she sang them. And I'll get into that in a moment. But Phil Garland, the late great journalist Phil Garland, interviewed Aretha Franklin for her book, The Sound of Soul. And Phil Garland, I could write for the next 100 years and probably couldn't write a paragraph as beautiful as the one that Phil Garland wrote about Aretha Franklin, which I think ushers us further in to thinking about genius. When Phil Garland says, Aretha Franklin sings of life, of love, and the terrible thrill-driven torment of lust with an uncompromising honesty of feeling that leads one to believe that every twisted note, every conjugated cadence and imploring lyric has been ripped from the bowels of her own soul. She feels, and so she is, and thus she sings. To hear her is to not be entertained. It is to undergo a baptism of emotion that leaves one weak and yet unfulfilled, as in the aftermath of good sex. This is the soulful side of Aretha Franklin that springs from a sheer sensuality baked down in the brimstone expressiveness of her Baptist upbringing. But there is more to it than that, a fine sense of musicianship that leads her to place her rhythmic accents in the right places, a fundamental knowledge of the blues as a pianist, as well as a singer, a dramatic instinct on which to build her shrieked and wailed climaxes. She is truly something else. Now, end quote. Now, let me take a few moments and unpack that a little bit. So, in this description of Aretha Franklin's artistry, Phil Garland gives us two really important things. Well, she gives us a lot of important things, but she says, and she points to this sort of innate, visceral according to her description, ability of Aretha Franklin to again remain in the lineage of a Billie Holiday, a Ma Rainey, a Bessie Smith, and her ability to develop an aesthetic language to mirror and interpret the lives of Black women, the heartbreak, the lust, the loss, the love, all of it. She recognizes that that is a type of genius in and of itself, the ability to do that so accurately, so fully and completely. But what I also appreciate about Phil Garland's analysis is that she doesn't just leave it in the providence of the visceral or the innate or the talent. There's also a work ethic and an acumen present as well. Aretha Franklin was a musician who studied and learned and paid attention and was very clear about what she was aiming for in terms of the musicality of her experiences. There was spirit. There absolutely was and always is spirit with Aretha Franklin. But she, even as a sort of, she didn't come to a conservatory like this, but she participated in the oldest conservatory in Black American music, which is the Black Church. She was the daughter of C.L. Franklin, who was known as the man with $1 million voice, who was one of the most successful preachers in the United States in the 20th century. He predates Martin Luther King, and he was able to record his sermons and sell them across the country. He was a superstar in his own right. And as such, he was able to draw all kinds of musicians and kept all kinds of musicians in his orbit, including the great blues singer, Dinah Washington, the great gospel singer, Mahalia Jackson, the great jazz pianist, Art Tatum, the great gospel pioneer and singer, Clara Ward, and Aretha Franklin's eventual collaborator, the great gospel great James Cleveland. All of these were direct mentors to Aretha Franklin. And she speaks about what she learned from each one, how to praise songs like Dinah Washington, how to project and sort of come from the sort of the fiery side of spirit from Mahalia Jackson, how to arrange songs on piano from James Cleveland. And so, you know, it is really important to me in talking about Black American music. Conservatories, schools, places like that were not options for so many of the most talented musicians. And then a lot of them did come, but yet and still that genius, as is described by Angela Davis and Sarah Jasmine Griffin, did not need that sort of finishing school in order to make itself known, right? And so it's a nice to have, but isn't always absolutely obligatory. So Phil Garland, in her quote, she points to Aretha Franklin's exceptional level of musicality that gave her the technique to be able to develop the aesthetic system in order to mirror the experiences of the Black community to whom she was singing for so many years. I want to talk a little bit more about the Black church. Church services and Black Baptist worship services are musical events. The service may last for about 2 hours, and there may only be one element of it that does not directly include music. And that's when people are perhaps reading the announcements of what's happening in the upcoming week. But very often, a pianist will play softly underneath that even, right? And so Aretha Franklin's indoctrination into the Baptist church tradition, the availability of genius musicians in their own right in her home, the touring that she did with her father from a little girl, where she had to learn how to sing in front of audiences at 11, 12, 13 years old, all sharply shaped her ability to render herself authentic in whatever situation she found herself in, right? So those are that's kind of the context in which we get Aretha Franklin. Further, her mother was a very fine church pianist. She studied with her mother as well. She sang with her sisters. All of 3 of her sisters could sing and co-wrote with her. And so at every turn, she is sharpening and developing her musical ideas in community with primarily Black women, right? And Aretha Franklin's life wasn't ideal, wasn't perfect, although she grew up in a life of economic privilege. She had her first child at 14. She lost her mother at 8. And so if we are looking for that note of heartbreak and authenticity of life experience in such a young voice, we have the stage set for that to happen. If we continue thinking along the lines about her musicianship, a good colleague of mine, Charles Crowengold, he said this. He said, the more I study Aretha Franklin's works in life, the more I see that she's not just a musical genius, which is something we normally imagine as bursting forth at inspired moments, but also someone who possessed a smartest person in the room capacity for grasping musical problems and possibilities. And I should have pulled it for this talk, there's footage of her working in the studio alongside tremendous session musicians, such as the Muscle Shoals musicians in Alabama, some of the musicians she worked with at Columbia Records, where she, a young woman, is in the studio with all of these musicians, and she remains very convinced and clear about her own approaches to songwriting, her own approaches to arranging, and she was not afraid to speak up and to stand on what she thought would be best for a song. That also brought her friction with certain producers over the years, where she would have a certain idea about what was to happen, and the producers, who were very often men, would have different ideas about where her sound should go. But that just affirms too that she was far more than one with deep soul and experience. She also had exceptional musicianship to accompany her music. So I told you her funeral, something terrible happened at her funeral, and that got me thinking about genius. The other point that happened, which actually precedes the funeral, was the day that Aretha Franklin died. Aretha Franklin died on April 16th, 2018. And it is tradition in New York City that when an African-American artist of note passes away, people spontaneously gather at the world famous Apollo Theater in Harlem, New York City. The Apollo Theater has hosted everyone is where Ella Fitzgerald got her start at his amateur night program, where she was supposed to take the stage as a dancer. But at the last minute, she chose to sing, and we're so grateful that she did. James Brown recorded his live album at the Apollo Theater in Harlem. And Aretha Franklin first appeared, not first, but her most notable performance at the Apollo happened in June 1971. And so the ritual around the death of a Black genius is that the Apollo Theater will, and I'm going to share a picture from her 1971 marquee so you can see it. So you see here, this is the marquee of the Apollo Theater, which is on the busiest thoroughfare in Harlem, 125th Street. And it's the landmark of Harlem, the Apollo Theater. Interestingly enough, it originally opened as a theater that did not permit Black people to enter at all or perform at all. And it's funny how history works out. Now it is, sort of one of our most hallowed grounds in Black performance. So Aretha Franklin in 1971, and you see the marquee, she's home, Aretha Franklin. This is after she's been crowned the Queen of Soul. This is after a string of hits such as Respect and Dr. Feelgood and Ain't No Way, and all of these songs that really solidified her space and her place in American music. She comes home to do a concert at the Apollo Theater. And that, I love that phrase, she's home, that claiming of her, that this is a place, this is her place, this is a place for her. So when she died, that marquee, it's a digital marquee now. It wasn't then, obviously. That marquee changes to say rest in peace, Aretha Franklin, with 1942 to 2018 underneath. And the people who work at the Apollo, they bring out these massive speakers and they play Aretha Franklin's music. And I think that day, maybe they did it for about 8 or 9 hours. And people just gather. The same thing happened when Prince died, when Michael Jackson died, but this was the day that Aretha Franklin passed. And so I live in New York City. I knew what to do. I hopped on the subway. I went to Harlem. I went to the Apollo Theater, and there were already scores and scores of people of all races, but predominantly Black women out there celebrating the life of Aretha Franklin. And so going back to this idea that Aretha Franklin, her work, her songs are genius at reflecting the lives of Black women. I want to share one last quote, and this comes from Daphne Brooks. And she wrote after Aretha Franklin this homage called Drenched in Glory, how Aretha Franklin gave voice to embattled Black women and transformed the nation. And she wrote, "The marvel and wonder of Dr. Aretha Franklin," because Aretha Franklin received many honorary degrees in her lifetime. And the reason we mourn her death so deeply is that she taught us so much about the preciousness of our emotions, our inner worlds and desires. She dared to voice and make public the nuanced, emotionally heterogeneous interiority of Black womanhood, becoming a conduit for articulating the beauty and sensuousness, the rage and despair, the sadness, as well as the joy of Black life, transduced through African American female musicianship. She turned the vocal run, her ability to sing these astounding melismas, she turned the vocal run itself into 1,000 miles of freedom. The intelligence of her melisma, a kind of singing in which notes upon notes are strung together into one syllable, lifted that musical gesture out of the Black church and planted it firmly in the mainstream, transforming the style of popular singing. So in this quote, Daphne Brooks makes this connection again between how the musicality of Aretha Franklin, I don't know how many singers we have, but melismas and soul music and gospel are just really, really hard to do well, I would say. She makes this note that Aretha Franklin's ability to do that had a twofold impact. One, deep resonance with the lives of Black women, but two, it transformed American popular music, right? And so it is the both and. Aretha Franklin doesn't belong exclusively to Black women, but she belongs first to Black women. Those are the audiences and the teachers who nurtured her genius and first responded to her genius so that she could continue to collaborate and develop her musicality until it reached the point in 1967 where it flowered into an earth-shattering sound that transformed American popular music forever. So when I went to the Apollo Theater on April 18, 2018, I should not have been surprised at how Black women had gathered to honor their queen. So as most people, I had my cell phone with me and I took some video of that day. And I want to show clips of 3 different moments throughout that day. As an ethnomusicologist, I'm an ethnographer. And so, I'm always documenting and observing. I can't turn that part of my brain off. And so that moment was so resonant with me because, as I said earlier, Aretha Franklin was around in my life, but it was the women in my life, the older Black women in my life, my mother's age, for whom Aretha Franklin was such a pivotal part of their existence, and they would cry and sway to her songs. And it was in this moment that all of those worlds came together. So I'm going to share a little bit of Amazing Grace, the hymn that Aretha Franklin is famous for, a little bit of Dr. Feelgood, and then lastly, a little bit of Aretha Franklin's version of Shaka Khan's I'm Every Woman. And in these clips, and then we'll talk about them on the other side, but in these clips, again, I would invite you to really observe the way in which the women present, and most of them are older women who are at the center of this gathering. And what you will see, people have planted and laid down flowers where Aretha Franklin's name is etched into the sidewalk in the Apollo Walk of Fame. And I want you to note how the women who are most center to that gathering are women who would somewhere be around Aretha Franklin's age. And keep in mind these words from Farrah Jasmine Griffin, Angela Davis, and Daphne Brooks as we listen and watch. So hopefully this works. And I'm gonna kind of skip around a little bit just to get certain points. If it were up to me, we watch all of them in their entirety, but you don't have time. Did everybody hear okay? I could really just watch the whole thing, but but again, you see in that example, in that clip, in that moment, Aretha Franklin is both alive and a portal for women to grieve the loss of her physical body, but also sing about their own lives. In that moment, they're singing Amazing Grace alongside Aretha Franklin, both for her and for themselves. In that moment, the cheers that you hear, the vocal inflections that you hear are no different than one would hear in an actual church if Aretha Franklin were singing from the pulpit in that moment. In that way, that the idea of shrine to Aretha really takes on and leans into that religious symbolism and becoming both a tribute to someone who is lost, who's seen as a friend, who's seen as a confidant, who's seen as a comrade, who's seen as a genius. But as women gather, they sing and reflect on their own existence and are able to render their own experience through the mourning and the celebration of Aretha Franklin's life. So I had to do Amazing Grace first because that one gets me like teary. And so I want to show a couple clips from the other songs. And I should say too, you see it was dark outside. And so the Apollo Theater saved Amazing Grace for the last song. And so they understood, the folks who were playing the music understood the power of that hymn in particular and the impact it would have on its audience. And so they saved it and made that the culminating song of the day. And so you'll see from the other two clips, those happened during the daytime. And I think this one is, I got them out of order. I think this one is Dr. Feelgood. And in this clip, again, pay attention to, we spoke earlier about how these are musics that are used in the lives of Black women to process their own situations in which they find themselves. So note how passionately and knowingly the women are singing along with the record. Wait, I'm gonna go back a little bit. A star with the flower tribute. So you hear their familiarity with the record. They can almost overtake the record with their congregational singing of Dr. Feelgood, right? And again, these women that you see at the center closest to the sacred space, which is where Aretha Franklin's name appears under that marquee, they were keeping watch. Many people came and went throughout the day. I was out there for the entirety, but that core group of older Black women remained the same. The specific women would switch out, but the people who held watch, who kept watch in that, what was then temporarily that sacred space, the closest they could get to Aretha Franklin in that moment were women born in the 40s, the 50s, the early 60s, her comrades, her peers, who knew and had lived her work best, held that space for her in that moment. The last clip I'll share is a joyful one of them singing "I'm Every Woman," Aretha Franklin's "I'm Every Woman." And here you get to see this elder Black woman joy, what Aretha Franklin embodied for them, not just in heartbreak and sensuality, but also pure and unadulterated joy. I told you I could just watch these. But in moments like this that may seem frivolous, the question must be asked: in a country where Black women are 3 times as likely to die in childbirth as white women, where Black women are paid less than both Black men, white women, and white men, where are Black women free to gather and enjoy and to mourn and to celebrate their bodies and who they are in ways such as this, right? That is the space that Aretha Franklin opened up for them. And so that day, that experience, being out there with these women, completely shifted how I thought and why I thought thinking about Black feminine genius is important. Because if the scholarship that I do doesn't have a place for women like those that I saw that day, what am I doing, right? As a scholar of African American music. It needn't only be the learned audiences of jazz clubs in New York City. It needn't only be the preachers in the pulpit of the Black church, but the everyday folks who imbue this music with life and take it as their own and make it and use it as a part of their life's experience. Where are they in my scholarship? So I'll close, but just returning to, I mentioned earlier that I have under contract an edited volume on Aretha Franklin, which hopefully will be out in the world in a couple of years. But that shifted my thought about the kinds of conversations we needed to have about Aretha Franklin, really centering her own humanity alongside her musical scholarship, how she saw the world in which she existed and the world that she was helping to create alongside her music. And I'm grateful that with Cambridge, they've given me the latitude to really reimagine what a full conversation about Aretha Franklin should sound like. The connections between, for her, which were deep connections between soul music and soul food. She loved to cook. How do we put those two things in conversation? And for her, both her ability to cook soul food, which is, you know, African American Southern cuisine, what worked in tandem with soul music, her ability to gather people, to host and extend herself in ways that she found meaningful, to draw her loved ones nearer to her. So I'm looking forward to continuing to work on that book and hopefully get it out into the world. But I'm going to stop here because I've talked a lot. And I look forward to any questions or feedback that you all have. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctora Fredara Hadley. One thing before I wanted to talk about the Blues Legacy and Black Feminism book. What do you think about the documentary Amazing Grace that came out in November 2018? Because you were talking about her work ethics, and that was great, but in that documentary, she doesn't seem much in control. What do you think about that?
So the Amazing Grace the concert film, I love it.
Yeah.
And I use it in classes. And so I think the question of control comes up, and I always think that's a really interesting one. I actually think she is in complete control in that in that space. Okay. She fought. This is again 1972. So Aretha Franklin at the height of her career, and she had to argue with her record label to even be able to do that. She was very clear. She wanted to do it at New Temple Baptist church in Los Angeles. She wanted to do it in a
Yes.
Black Baptist church. She wanted it to be a live recording. And in order for it to be a live recording that she wanted, she needed the congregation there. She chose her collaborators and her musicians. And her chief collaborator in that project was Reverend James Cleveland, who we see serving as MC, musician, music director in that documentary. And what we witnessed is the immense amount of trust that she had in James Cleveland. And so I find it so interesting that she doesn't speak at all from the microphone in the edited version that we have of that film. But I don't think it is a testament to her powerlessness. James Cleveland himself says, she's the reason we're all here tonight. She's the reason that called everything together, all the people together, the TV cameras, everything is her doing. Now we know after her Times interview, I'm blanking on the year, Aretha Franklin became very reluctant to give interviews and became very careful with her speech, because what is also true, very often the words of Black women and the stories of Black women are used for and misconstrued for some other gain, for some ulterior motive. And her Times article, which she thought was, kind of a standard industry up and coming artist piece, ended up being more of an expose. And really, she felt like betrayed her trust. So with Amazing Grace, I think, again, she is the orchestrator and she chooses to not, and again, we don't know what was edited out. We don't know what we didn't see, but from the version that we do have available, knowing the relationship with Aretha Franklin and James Cleveland that goes back to her childhood. James Cleveland actually lived in their house for a good time when she was a little girl and was the minister of music at her father's church, New Bethel Baptist Church in Detroit. So he was a very, very close family friend. I think she saw him as sort of a big brother and someone who was able to take care of all of the sort of production things and the run of the show things, as well as know her well enough to adapt the flow of the music in such a way as to keep her comfortable.
Okay, all right. Well, in the book, the Angela Davis book, she mentioned how that music can be a rich terrain for examining historical feminist consciousness that reflected the lives of working class Black communities. Who are then for you Aretha Franklin's predecessors and legacies in this type of Black feminine genius, Fredara?
That's a great question. And of course, I'm going to agree with everything Angela Davis says, but also I'm thinking about the scholar Brittany Cooper, and she says that because academic institutions were denied most Black women coming out of the 19th century into the 20th century, if we want to tap into Black women's intellectual thought, we have to look at what she calls an eclectic archive. Meaning that Black women didn't get to write books. Most of them didn't get to write books and essays and all of that. But that does not mean that Black women weren't reflective about their own existence in the world and what was going on in their lives. So if we don't have essays and books with which to seek, where should we look? And Angela Davis is absolutely right. Look in the lyrics of the music. Look in the organizations that they created. Look in some of the quilt working that they did, to see how they are reflecting on their own lives. And so if I think about Aretha Franklin's predecessors, I would absolutely say people like Dinah Washington, who was also from the Midwest, from Chicago. And Dinah Washington was known as the Queen of the Blues before Aretha Franklin became the Queen of Soul. And Dinah Washington also starts out as a gospel singer. And so in Dinah Washington, she has this duality of someone who is singing both sacred and secular music, and someone who is singing music that is meant to resonate with the breadth of Black women's experiences. And Dinah Washington lived a difficult life. And so, and that ended tragically. And I believe Aretha Franklin was paying attention to those stories as well. So Dinah Washington absolutely won. Mahalia Jackson, the great gospel singer Mahalia Jackson, who is from New Orleans and immigrates to Chicago and becomes one of gospel's first superstars, if you will. Again, just an extraordinary voice she has. And in listening to Mahalia Jackson, I believe that Aretha Franklin learns how to sing hymns, learns how to sing spirituals in ways that are so profound. And Mahalia Jackson was one who modeled, to get back to Angela Davis's book, Blues Legacies. Mahalia Jackson was a singer who modeled her own vocal approach off the blues singer, Bessie Smith, right? And so we have this continuity of the relationship between blues and gospel music from the very beginning, quite honestly. And so Mahalia Jackson, I believe, was Aretha Franklin's godmother, perhaps, but she spent quite a lot of time with her. And Mahalia Jackson, although she sang gospel, she was very, very committed to the cause of civil rights. She was a confidant of Martin Luther King, and coincidentally, today is April 4th, and this is the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. But Mahalia Jackson was a chief fundraiser for the civil rights movement. She was a confidant of Martin Luther King. She often sang before he preached and gave a sermon. And we see Aretha Franklin slide into a similar posture, both in how she is the songist before her father preaches. She is also dedicated to civil rights. She models that piece of what Mahalia Jackson values and what her father valued as well. And she is a huge, a tremendous advocate for Martin Luther King. She sang at Martin Luther King's funeral as well. And when Angela Davis, who we were speaking about, is arrested, she offers to bail Angela Davis out of jail because she says specifically she gets her money from Black people. And so why wouldn't she give it back to Black people? So she is mindful of the connections between all those things. So Mahalia Jackson, Dinah Washington, and then her flair for and her panache in terms of her performance style, I would say she gets that from Clara Ward, who was the great gospel singer Clara Ward and the Ward Singers. Clara Ward was also a close family friend, and she appears in that documentary, Amazing Grace, that you mentioned. But Clara Ward comes out of the Baptist Church of Philadelphia with the Ward Singers, but she is not content to remain in church spaces. She begins singing gospel, and YouTube is full of clips of this. She begins singing gospel in nightclubs, on television shows. And so this idea that a singer as talented as Aretha Franklin does not have to remain solely in the church is something that she models from Clara Ward, right? And then again, her mother and her mother's fine ability as a pianist. Aretha's first piano teacher is her mother. And so her mother's musicality is imprinted on Aretha Franklin as well. So I would say those are the main predecessors of Aretha Franklin. And she, throughout her career, paid homage to them. So if you go back again to Amazing Grace, she sings the song, How I Got Over. How I Got Over is a song that was written and first recorded by Clara Ward, made even more famous by Mahalia Jackson. On one of Aretha Franklin's first albums with Columbia Records, where she mostly sang standards, she does her own version of Dinah Washington's This Bitter Earth, right? And so throughout, and then, she pays homage to Sarah Vaughan by doing her own version of Skylark. And so in her career, she is consistently referring to these phenomenal Black women geniuses that came before her. Even in the clip we just watched from the Apollo, she's singing I'm Every Woman, which was first recorded by Shaka Khan, who is a peer of hers at that point, right? But she's referencing the artistry, the music of these other Black women who either traveled before her or alongside her. And in academia, we say that citations are a political practice. Who you are citing, who you are choosing to refer to, whose voices you are centering actually really matters. And throughout Aretha Franklin's career, she continuously refers to these phenomenal singers and musicians that have left their handprint on her own career.
Wow, very interesting. One last question. Are there limits on to how we contextualize and define genius? And is the question of genius even still relevant for you, Dr. Hadley?
That's a great question. I don't think that there are limits. And, you know, the Grammys just aired last night here in the United States. And I don't know if it's because of my age or because of the way the world is, but a lot of the people who were winning Grammys, I was happy for them, but I didn't know them. Point being that we increasingly, because of technology, live in a musically fragmented world where people can just occupy, like, this is my genre over here, and I kind of live in this world. And we may not see as many or very many transcendent musical figures that cut across all kinds of lines the way we had in previous generations, because the technology is different. You know, I often say, when I know Aretha Franklin because my parents were listening to Aretha Franklin, and if they, as a child, if they were listening to Aretha Franklin, I was listening to Aretha Franklin. I didn't have the option to kind of go off on my own and have my own little musical world. That wasn't an option. So technology is fundamentally changing how we share a music experience. I don't think that that means genius goes away. I think that that means that we have to be more sophisticated in understanding what is resonating with a particular music community. I think we have to care more about that. And I think we have to abandon this idea that genius is a solitary construct where someone descends from a mountain and presents something and the world just oohs and ahs about it and says, this is amazing. I think what it is useful for us to think of more, as I said in the beginning, the idea of genius is always racialized in gender. It's just that when we often talk about gender, we don't say that part. We don't say the masculine part. We don't say the white part. We don't say those things. And so what I think we call for is being more intentional and saying, like, if a community has endowed this person with the idea of mastery and said that what you are doing is us, reflects us, helps us to live our lives, helps us to see ourselves, I think we start by taking that seriously and not immediately going to the posture, well, it cannot be so, right? And so I do think it's useful because it does push us to think about what is so impactful about a particular music or a particular person doing a particular music. So I see value in thinking expansively in that way about it and starting to reimagine a community-informed notion of genius and making sure that more communities get to say who a genius is. Oh, I think you're on mute.
No, it sounds great. If there's any other question, no? Okay, I think we'll leave it here then. Dr. Hadley, thank you very, very much for your presentation. It's been fabulous. And thank you everyone for joining us. I wanna remind you as a final word that Gender Sound Sessions will present this coming Thursday. There will be Professor Rolf Baker will talk about women and music in the Middle Ages. And as I said, on the 25th of this month, we expect to see you with Dr. Lucy O'Brien and her presentation about punk feminism. Dr. Hadley, thank you again. We expect you to come to Barcelona soon.
I would love to.
Okay. Thank you very much. Hasta la próxima.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Adios.
Thank you. Thank you.
Adios.